I was thinking about the Galactic Empire the other day, like every day. The Empire began as a caricature. Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin are essentially Ming the Merciless, evil because the story needs bad guys. But as that mythos evolved, that line from heir to the Empire all the way through to Andor, making the Empire more nuanced, both more dysfunctional and more believable, it becomes a vehicle to ask some fairly significant questions about the context of political movements and the nature of power in our own world. So first off, I'm going to troll just a little bit by positioning the Empire as the moderate scenario. On one end, we have Star Trek's United Federation of Planets. Open, diplomatic, mostly peaceful, triumphant liberalism. Because it exists in a setting where win-win scenarios are the norm. On the other end of the spectrum, Warhammer 40k and the Imperium of Man. Living in the Imperium really sucks for trillions of people. And if that regime existed under different conditions, say like Star Trek, it would be incredibly brittle, just waiting for something to shatter it. But instead, its setting is a world where actual demons can manifest if you use the wrong machines or dabble in the wrong practices. It's a matter of record that vast regions of the galaxy have been lost that way. Between chaos entities lurking on the edges of reality, clawing to get in, and nearly every Xenos race having turned on humanity in the past, the Imperium's policy of inward conformity and outward hostility is a rational response to the universe it exists within. The Federation and Imperium are both responses to their conditions. Swap settings, and they don't work. The Galactic Empire sits between these two, authoritarian, militaristic, and regularly engaging in some rather horrific things, but still a state that functions within the context of a galaxy of vast cultural diversity. There's open interstellar commerce, fairly free travel. The human-dominated Empire isn't out exterminating Rhodians and Ugnaughts. And the Empire is an answer to a failed republic in a civil war, an alternative to fear and chaos. That lends it some sense of legitimacy. If we look at its rise not from the standpoint of the Jedi, the defenders of the old order being pushed out, but the average citizen that's sick of the bullshit, the elected chancellor concentrating powers and ending the war looks a lot less like an evil wizard's power grab.
The Jedi have tried to overthrow the Republic.
A whole lot of normies accept the Jedi insurrection story and Palpatine's legitimacy. For the average Imperial citizen, the Empire isn't a crushing evil, it's just the government. It probably taxes them too much and has a bunch of annoying rules, unpopular wars, no doubt rumors of all sort of weird, evil, ritual shit going on at the highest levels. But for the vast majority, it's not taking their children or forcing them into a labor camp. Dude, that's what the whole first season of Andor was about. Yeah, just hold your Gundars there. That's actually my point. When Cassian Andor is picked up on that beach, he's shuffled off to prison on bogus charges. He's put to work on long, grueling shifts. His sentence is open-ended. He's enslaved by the state. A grave injustice, and one that would turn most of us into bomb-throwing revolutionaries. But the point here is that that's not the typical experience. Those troopers weren't out rounding up tourists. Most of the people are just going about their business unmolested. Andor, however, is traveling under a false identity. He has no connections, no family. As far as the law enforcement system can tell, he's one lone poor guy that no one will miss. Exactly the sort you can send to a labor camp without much trouble. Cassian Andor is part of an underclass, particularly vulnerable by being alone in an unfamiliar place. And this happens in our own society. The United States has a vast for-profit prison system that makes money on both ends, from the government for housing inmates and from industry for renting out their labor for pennies on the dollar. Core Civic, for example, a publicly traded company. If you have any kind of investment portfolio or retirement account, you probably have a financial stake in it, either directly or through major shareholders like BlackRock. And there are people just like Cassian Andor, fed into the system for being poor, unconnected, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. Laboring away in captivity because a bunk needed to be filled for contractual purposes as much as for any crime they might be accused of. But the system has institutional buy-in from the vast majority of people, and that includes people who oppose what's happening. We're ruled over by a bunch of Skeksis. And yet, I must admit that when tax time came, I grudgingly cut a check through gritted teeth and clenched knuckle-white fists around the pen. Because I'm not ready to start down the path that ends in a glorious and principled last stand just yet. The vast majority of us aren't Cassian or Luthen. We're all those other people enjoying the beach. Maybe thinking the troopers are a bit too much, but they're not bothering us, and no one wants to go back to the corruption and civil war of the old days. It could be a lot worse. Have another margarita. It doesn't excuse the injustices any more than throwing your life away on a symbolic gesture remedies them. The Empire, like our own governments, stands on twin pillars of fear and buy-in. And it's the second one that's by far the more important. If it has that, then the pool of active rebels is narrowed down to those who are personally aggrieved in some way, such as Cassian Andor or Jyn Erso, or in a different way, Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, or the ideological zealots, for example, Luthen Rael. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap. Recently, I read a piece by Eric Shulman, he's a professor in Toronto, where he looked at this point through the lens of the film Taken. I'll link the article in the description. The short version relevant here is that the human trafficking network in that film is held together entirely by violence and the fear of violence. It has no real institutional power because no one is loyal to the organization. They're all open to a change in the threat calculus at any given moment, and so the entire thing can be taken apart a piece at a time. Remove the immediate threat of violence at any point in the chain and you sever the organization. It's just a chain of people threatening people below them because they're scared of the people above. The Empire absolutely uses fear, coercion, and open violence to maintain its position. But the Empire has actual power as well. People go to work for it, obey its laws, pay its taxes, all without having a stormtrooper holding a blaster to their head the whole time. It's seen as legitimate by the vast majority of people. Which isn't to say they necessarily like it. Go cheerfully wave little sunburst cog flags at parades, cheer the Emperor's speeches. Merely that they have a stake in it. If nothing else, they believe the likely alternatives are worse. Most of them aren't going to go be insurgents. We can see this same scenario looking at the US or Europe today. Plenty of people are pissed off, but not very many are out physically fighting the forces of the corruption. It's not cowardice, acceptance, or laziness. It's just that there's still enough buy-in to the institutions to keep most of us from going full Mad Max. Which is why the rebellion needs to be careful. Andor touches on this with Luthen bombing a public space in Naboo, no doubt framing the rebels as terrorists for many. And it's also the core of Dedra's plan on Gorman.
You need Gorman rebels you can depend on to do the wrong thing.
I'm not arguing that the rebels are the real bad guys. I'm saying that in the process of fighting the Empire, the establishment that most people accept as legitimate, they are not simply fighting and hopefully removing an oppressive regime. They're establishing a new context for the next one. A context where taking up arms against the authorities is an appropriate political action and where the primary purpose of government is to impose its control against alternatives to itself. A new state born of a revolution has to translate the capacity for violence into real power. It has to get buy-in while simultaneously dismantling it for anyone else. And it has to do this after establishing for all to see that violence is the route to political change. The problem with revolutions is that you set a precedent for the next band of malcontents. So you have a tendency toward more aggressive control, more militancy, more concentration of power, or at least its short-term substitute, the capacity for violence. They can't restore the Republic, the conditions have changed too much, in part through their own actions. Whatever follows the Empire will be more militant and more reliant on raw force while it tries to establish that institutional buy-in. The new Republic will exist in a more dangerous and disorderly world and will have to act accordingly. It'll be forced to be more like the Empire regardless of its ideology or self-image. If it doesn't, something else will sweep it aside. In contrast, Star Trek consistently shows us a setting where the characters already have that deep institutional buy-in. Starfleet relies on that. Admiral Nechayev could be a stone bitch at times, but Captain Picard could push back without having to worry about being executed on a whim. It's not raw fear that makes Starfleet work. It's deep investment in the institution at every level. And it's worth noting that the war with the Dominion threatened to change that context. The Deep Space Nine two-parter Homefront and Paradise Lost is on the one hand an almost quaint 1990s take on terrorism and the government response to it. It begins with a bombing at a diplomatic conference, and the security apparatus jumps into action. Earth is this incredibly open and accepting society. The best minds in the quadrant come to Earth, and the culture is very high trust and respectful of the individual, which helps to foster an environment conducive to innovation and building effective and trusted institutions. And it's quite good at fighting attacks that come by ship from outside. But it has a very weak immune system when it comes to defending against threats that don't attack head-on. Admiral Layton is trying to harden Earth and other Starfleet facilities against the kind of infiltration shapeshifters can pull off. He gets a lot of pushback to the point that he plans to stage a military coup. And on paper, he would make Earth a much harder target and Starfleet that much stronger. But he would also be sacrificing some of that institutional buy-in, giving up power in exchange for force, and in so doing, playing into the Dominion's hands long term. The damage from a terrorist attack isn't from the attack so much as the second and third order effects that ripple through society as a result. The fear and uncertainty, the distrust of institutions that derive their authority from a promise of protection they're unable to keep. The intrusive security measures directed at the average person while attacks keep happening.
And the next thing you know, Starfleet security officers are on the streets of every city, armed with phaser rifles, blood-testing citizens at random.
These things are poison to free and open societies. It's captured in a scene between Captain Sisko and his father during an argument over submitting to the blood test used to find shapeshifters.
You actually thought I was one of them, didn't you?
I don't know. I wasn't sure.
That breakdown of trust, that persistent fear and suspicion corrodes a high-trust society very quickly. Incidentally, the test is faked multiple times in the series. It's security theater more than anything else. But Layton isn't just some would-be dictator. Unlike the Federation president and many others, he recognizes that an enemy that can impersonate anyone, infiltrate anywhere, and that operates on long timescales changes the context of Starfleet's defensive posture. The methods they use to fight Klingons or the Borg aren't enough. Starfleet needs to adapt to a setting with a different kind of danger. He just tries to brute force a solution that would end up being counterproductive. His motive isn't wrong, only his method. He needs to find a way that maintains the institutional buy-in. Another notable example here is a Legend of the Galactic Heroes, telling a sprawling story of conflict between an empire and a republic. One day I will dive into that in depth, but not this day. For now, I just want to point out the broad premise that both sides think they're the good guys, and neither is really wrong. They have different assumptions, different ideological biases, but both the Empire and the Republic have that institutional buy-in. Neither one is propped up entirely by fear, even though the Empire fits the space Nazi mold almost satirically, complete with characters named Siegfried and Reinhard, lots of fun something or others in spiffy black uniforms. It works because they have rational objectives that follow from who and where they are, not just at the top, but throughout the organization. In all these cases, the empires have to be considered not only in terms of how they're structured, but their context. The enlightened space liberal of Star Trek is just a chaos thrall in 40K. But so what? How is this nerd shit relevant to anything? Because our world too is a setting, one with conditions that exist by nature of that setting. Every national policy, whether it's China organizing its military, Russia's oil industry, Iran's nuclear program, all of it takes place within the context of a world dominated by a Western liberal order. Neoliberal order now, which is kind of like New Coke in that nobody asked for it, but we got it anyway. In the West, people react to the neoliberal hegemony mostly by attacking its abuses and failures. We're so ensconced in it that we can criticize liberalism and not entirely realize that we're doing it based on the standards of liberalism. It's just part of how the world is. Our fallen old republic, our chaos gods of the warp, is neoliberalism. And not only within, but everything in our world is affected by it. It's a defining condition of the setting. And once you see that, it alters the perception of global politics. Consider China. By many metrics, the greatest rival of the United States, and by extension of that neoliberal order. Of course, we have to consider the matchup in terms of resources, demographics, military capacity, industrial base, geography, on, but also the context of the setting. So you have the traditional Chinese cultures going way back with a thin layer of Maoist communist ideology glazed over, itself having taken its basic form from outside influences that were reacting to an earlier version of that liberal order. The Communist Party tried to just plow forward on ideology and hopium with the Great Leap Forward, a parade of incompetence that greatly increased production of dead bodies and not much else. But China has become very successful anyway, largely by abandoning most of that Maoist baggage and practice and engaging directly with that liberal capitalist world around it. China embraced the methods of the liberal West, jumped into the marketplace, played the West's free market game and played it well. Their military is heavily Western influenced, whether in terms of technology, organizational forms, even uniform fashion. I'm speaking broadly here, don't type up that long comment about the PLA's NCO problem just yet. China's policies are always to some degree shaped by that Western neoliberal setting surrounding it, which suggests, while I won't use the G word here for a multitude of reasons, the policy toward the Uyghurs is attenuated by the need to continue doing business with the West, hiding facilities, framing them as job training centers, misdirection to keep it on the sidelines. Without the weight of liberal sensibilities tied to their foreign markets, the party would probably be much more quick and efficient in their methods on that question. And that same logic applies to every nation state. Every organization outside that neoliberal bloc has to be considered not only on its actual conduct, whether militarily, human rights, whatever, but on how much it's constrained by the neoliberal setting of early 21st century Earth. We might be the evil empire, but we are having a moderating influence around the world. Everyone else is compelled to bend to the liberal sensibilities of the hegemonic power bloc to some degree, varying by how dependent they are and how well inclined the bloc is toward them. Israel can get away with a lot more than Iran regarding nuclear proliferation, for example. Things could be a lot worse, will be a lot worse if that moderating influence is somehow toppled or subverted and rotted out from within. Which is not to say that we don't need to get rid of the evil wizards running the empire. Taking down Sith Lords is good. But being righteous isn't the same as being right, and just being right doesn't always win. Sometimes the obvious enemy is just a symptom. Or a cruder example, if you topple the imperium of man, you don't usher in a new age of peace and prosperity. You get eaten by orcs. Viable long-term political and social change has to look at not only the thing it wants to change, but the setting that made the thing. What makes it viable, even inevitable? Where does its power come from? If it's really just the barrel of a gun, then you have it easy. It almost never is. And I invoke Mao here for a reason. Ideologies are responses to their setting, but they can easily become ossified and obsolete. Even revolutionary ideologies. I've spent a lot of time in universities and in factories over the last few decades. I've met a lot of Marxists in that time. They weren't in the factories. It's become an ideology of the surplus elites, people with credentials that in prior generations would have made them part of the managerial class, but who today are surplus to the actual need. Today's socialists mostly come from management, not labor. They're less interested in the means of production than seizing the fruits of production. But I'm not just bashing commies here, because they have learned a very important lesson about this. The long march through the institutions, taking positions of power within the existing system while simultaneously learning how to do things. building viable counter-institutions. That's how you seize control of big centralized systems without shattering them or losing the buy-in. And this shouldn't be confused with simply infiltrating. This idea has degenerated into groups like the DSA trying to take over the Democratic Party. An attempt to borrow the legitimacy of an existing institution, legitimacy they don't have and can't get on their own, while rotting out what made it function. A parasite revolution. We see this to some extent in Star Wars, which begins with Princess Leia using diplomatic cover to run classified information to the rebels. Galen Erso sabotaging the Death Star design. Luthen's mole on the ISB. It's all very effective at undermining the system, but it undermines the foundation of any system that follows as well. But the original concept, as articulated by Dushka and Marcuse, is a workable way to do it. Gradually change the system without destroying its perceived legitimacy. Change the system from the inside.
It's a trap!
That's fair. There is the ever-present danger of being co-opted by the system you're trying to change. It's a question of inertia versus resolve. The inertia of the system can easily beat you down into conformity, because any system of power inherently tries to perpetuate itself. It takes strong resolve and patience to alter its course. The root problem isn't so much who's in power, but power itself. It imposes its own rules, the highest of which is to expand. For example, we can look at today's crony capitalism, and it's easy to conclude that billionaires are the extraction mechanism of wealth, the source of corruption, the nexus of the abuses in the entire system. But they're an extraction mechanism, the one that fits this particular system at this particular time, the manifestation of the problem, not the root cause. Feudalism, socialism, fascism all had their own class of people at the top of the pyramid extracting the bulk of the wealth and using it to fuel the expansion of power over the vast majority. It's a function of power, not simply of a particular system. It's the argument that I often have with Marxists. I'm deeply suspicious of all systems of power. They're fixated on capitalism, a system, one of many. The Marxists aren't wrong, they're just myopic, so caught up in their particular model that they can't recognize that it is a model rooted in its own assumptions and biases. Under the hood, it's just another system of power, slightly rearranging the pieces. A more pointed critique of the Long March approach might bring up Hillary Clinton's thesis from 1969, pitting Saul Alinsky's focus on political agitation against changing the system from inside and finding the latter more viable. That she went on to become a personification of the neoliberal establishment swamp monster seems to suggest that this whole change from within approach is a dead end. But that would miss the real problem. The college radicals of the 1960s went on to dominate academia, the Democratic Party, the mainstream media, shifting the perceived center in their direction. But the underlying system of power was largely unchanged. The Long March takes time, and as one moves closer to the centers of power, self-interest starts to align with those centers of power. Sometimes you can find people who can both wield power and walk away from it, but as a general rule, people don't work that way. Organizations of people don't work that way. By the time the underdog becomes the new boss, they look a lot like the old boss. Which brings me to this unpopular observation. There's a case to be made that the most effective agents of change are those that are already inside the power structure, are secure in their benefits from it, and know how to navigate it. And it's notable that there's not just one rebellion.
Krieger's a separatist. Maipei's a neo-republican. The Gorman Front, the Partisan Alliance.
The one that actually seized power was the one run by insiders, by senators and aristocrats, not the hardline purists like Saw Gerrera here, but the people who already know how to wield power rather than just raw force. Which suggests that in the absence of viable, smaller units of government at more localized levels, the best way to defeat the Empire, or rather the Emperor, might be a military coup. For every Tarkin, there's a Thrawn. For every blindly obedient cog like Piet, there's a Pelion. Not champions of the people, certainly, but also not actively evil, simply professionals suspicious of the Emperor's crazy projects and inclined toward a less energetic style of statesmanship when it comes to internal repression. Back to DS9 and Admiral Layton's Starfleet coup. He planned it carefully, put his loyalists in place, ready to seize the key pieces of the military establishment with some measure of legal pretense.
Looks like Layton's been a busy man. He's personally reassigned over 400 officers in the past 3 weeks.
Forcing the rest to decide whether to formally go rogue or keep their heads down, wait and see. Often it's the latter in these cases, giving the coup plotters time to shore up their position in the narrative space. It probably wouldn't work in the Federation. It's too foreign, too sudden. But the Galactic Empire, a relatively seamless transition there. An officer's coup doesn't make for the archetypal hero's journey, but it does offer perhaps the most direct route back to peace and stability rather than descent into war and chaos, if it can be held together during the process. Sure, a military junta isn't a leap into a utopian future, but the question is it better than an objectively evil space wizard? Or let's go with a historical example. Say Stauffenberg had succeeded in assassinating Hitler. Would the resulting junta be better, worth negotiating with if it meant ending the war? Of course, the biggest problem in the Empire really is that there's one evil guy at the top. Our world is substantially more complicated. But in broad terms, the problem with taking down the Empire is that it's a centralizing force. It concentrates power, and in the process, all the potential decentralizing forces either atrophy or are actively stomped out. Toppling the Empire doesn't restore the previous state of dysfunctional but bland republicanism. It creates a power vacuum. And the people that can exploit power vacuums aren't the altruistic idealists, but the vicious rat bastards. My point with all this blither-blather pontificating is that fighting injustice is good. But people tend to fixate on a particular object, be it capitalism, the commies, the West, the patriarchy, Zog, whatever your particular bugbear happens to be, and assume if that thing were to go away, then everything would just be well, completely ignoring the context. What brought the object of their hate into being? What sustains it? What other monster is it holding in check? Sometimes you can just rip it out and celebrate its demise. But much more often it's not that simple, and the solution has to be surgical rather than blunt force. It requires the application of power, not just violence. And power requires forethought, not just reaction. For example, contrast the American Revolution with the revolution in Haiti. The empire didn't just happen one day. It was constructed a piece at a time over a long period. Its alternative must be built the same way, must be ready to wield power, not just grab at it. This uniform really does not suit me. Whether it's a question of philosophy or tailoring, I leave to the comments.